Good evening. I'd like to take the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about STEM education and the future of STEM education. So I'll just share my screen. So this is the second STEMinar for this year, and as you can see, Let's Talk STEM, shining the spotlight on the future of STEM education. So I'm Deb Corrigan, and I'm part of Education Futures, and I just wanted to briefly sort of talk to you about why Education Futures. Our focus is really on the learner, and that learner is from all stages of life. So it's not just confined to school. And we know that if we're going to make a difference to the lives of learners, then it's going to require us all to work together. So we're focused on true collaboration. We're focused on research, working with practitioners, working with industry, working with government, if we're actually going to imagine a new future for education policy and practice moving forward. And we also think research has got a lot to offer, both our own research and the research of other people, in terms of providing an evidence base for education and particularly educational leadership. So we want to enable access to that, but not only enable access to the academic research, but also probably feed that research back into the research literature. So hopefully by us doing research in collaborative ways with others, we'll re-inform that research. So that's what Education Futures is about. My particular field is, I'm a professor of science education, and I've been working in both science education and STEM education for quite some time. And in my experience, I often get asked 5 questions. So I thought it would be useful for me to actually do a review of the literature on STEM education and use it in ways that will answer the 5 questions that I always get asked from people in the profession. And those 5 questions listed here: what is STEM education? Why is it important? How do we include it in schools? What impact can it have? And what would be the indicators of success? And so we're launching the Spotlight Report number 2 from Education Futures, which is on STEM education and answering those 5 key questions. So what is STEM education? Okay, I'm making a difference here between STEM and STEM education. Clearly, STEM education is for the purposes of learning, and it is clearly focused on learning. STEM, on the other hand, is the practice that the professionals engage in when they come from those disciplinary fields of science, technology, maths and engineering. And it's interesting when you hear the professionals talk about their work, their practice in STEM. They don't often talk about the content that they engage in. They often talk about the skill set and the capabilities they have. So their problem-solving ability, their communication skills, their collaborative skills, their creativity, how they negotiate different problems that they come up against. And so I suppose I'm not focusing so much on the content here, but I'm focusing on making it's about what you do with the content. So I'm seeing disciplines very much in this sense as a way of thinking and acting. So knowledge for me is about thinking and acting and using that knowledge in particular ways. So STEM education then for me is the integration of science, technology, engineering and maths to explore real world problems. And that is key. Integration and real world problems. And we'll come back to that. Now you've seen this word cloud before, and I think it really highlights the point that I was just making before about STEM education and probably STEM as a practice. In the last STEMinar, participants were asked, as you can see, what was the one word they associated with this STEM education program. It struck me when I saw this for the first time after the last seminar that they're all doing words pretty much. So they're inspiring, they're engaging, they're inclusive, they're authentic, they're collaborative, all of the things that I've just said. Very rarely is there any mention of content or facts. I can't see equation in there. I can't see force in there. I can't see cells in there. They're all about the things that you want to do with the education program that you have. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So why is STEM education important? Now, I think it's really important that STEM education has a purpose all of its own. Okay. So for me, why STEM, it has to have an education purpose. So we need everybody to be STEM literate. So this isn't necessarily about the future workforce. This is actually about everybody. So I'm taking the words of Bybee here in saying, what is STEM literacy? And the little graphic actually explains it a little bit more. So it's about developing knowledge, attitudes and skills to identify real-world problems, identifying the problems that we can explore from a STEM lens is a really important skill. Understand the characteristics of STEM subjects. So yes, I'm not advocating that you don't study maths, science, technology, engineering. You do still have to know those characteristics, what it's like to think like a scientist, act like a scientist, think like a technician, act like a technologist. So that's still important. Develop an awareness of, an ability to explain both the natural and the design world with the knowledge that you have. So you have to seek out the knowledge, you have to apply the knowledge, you have to apply the concepts, and you have to solve some of those problems. So again, gain a willingness to engage and reflect upon a STEM-related issue and as a global citizen. So we have to actually think, so which expert do I believe? Why do I believe that? Who's more credible? What knowledge do I already have in order to help me make that decision? Is this really a problem that is, can be related to STEM? Can I solve it using those sorts of practices? They're the sorts of STEM literate activities that we need everybody to engage in. It's also important though because it has a very powerful education perspective. And I like Leonie Rennie's work, an Australian science education researcher. And so she says the power of STEM education can be evaluated in developing what she calls a worldly perspective that has two dimensions. So we need to get a balance between the traditional disciplinary knowledge that we have and the integrated knowledge that we will develop when we engage in STEM education. And the power comes from balancing those two out. So it's not just about knowing science. It's not just about knowing engineering or maths. It's actually about taking them and then working in the spaces on real world problems that utilise all of those knowledges that you have and balancing that out. So you do have to do both. And the second part of developing a worldly perspective is the balance between local knowledge and global knowledge. So you must understand the context in which you live and work, but at the same point in time, you also need the global perspective, but you need both. Currently, we try to focus too much on one or the other. So, in schools, for example, when people do STEM education programs, one of the things I often see is people pick really global issues. Right? That's really difficult because global issues are so multifaceted and really complicated and complex. And while you can do that, you can find the same sort of experiences locally. And so understanding your local context and how that is situated in a global context is a really important balance to maintain as well. And so when you get that balance right, there's a real power that comes from the knowledge and the education that you have in developing those worldly perspectives. The third question is how to include STEM education in school education. And I've talked about this in the report. We'll go into this in more detail, and I'm just highlighting the big points. But policy, from the policy level, if STEM education is going to be included in school education, it must have its own intrinsic educational value. And it's not an economic one, it's an education value. So the value from an education perspective around STEM education is that it provides the connections between the disciplines, capabilities and priorities. So the capabilities, critical creative thinking, ethics, all of those sorts of things, the priorities, Asia, Indigenous education, Indigenous cultures. It's the connections between those capabilities and those disciplines and those priorities which are generally valued in education. So I'm saying that through a STEM education, you can actually address all of those issues, because every teacher should be actually not only thinking about their discipline, but also thinking about the capabilities and the priorities and how they actually build those. From a school perspective, I'm just highlighting a couple of things here that we know from research that schools need to be mindful of. Individuals and students, in the case of schools, do not use knowledge learned in schools in everyday life. And they also do not bring what they've learned in everyday life into school. There sort of seems to be these two sort of realms of knowledge. There's the school knowledge and the everyday out of school knowledge. What we really need to do is to bring those together. You know, they should be interchangeable. We also know from research that learners do not transfer learning across school subjects. So what I'm learning in science and what I'm learning in maths are very rarely transferred across. And I know that from my own personal experience as a chemistry teacher who understands the fundamental imperative of understanding ratio if you're going to do any chemistry. And yet kids never connect the fact that they've learnt ratios in maths and they're now using it in chemistry. It's called the transfer paradox. And we really need to do something about that, because learning in single disciplines only keeps reinforcing the transfer paradox. So what a multidisciplinary curriculum can do, such as STEM, is to begin to address that very transfer paradox, but it also begins to address the in-school, out-of-school crossing and melding and transfer that never happens. And from a learning perspective, I'm going to draw here on what cognitive science and education researchers and teachers, for that matter, have known for quite some time. They've understood the importance of interest and motivation to learning. Okay, and I think the current climate where COVID-19 has pointed out the importance of the cognitive and the social learning being mixed together and not dealing with them separately. So we know from cognitive scientists and research that learning is constructive. It's not a receptive process, right? Learners have to construct their own understanding. They can't be told. We know that motivation and beliefs are integral to cognition, to learning, because you have to be motivated to do it and you have to believe you can do it. Social interaction is fundamental to cognitive development, and they have to be intertwined. And I think the need, so focusing only on cognitive, focusing only on social and well-being is not enough. They actually have to be intertwined. And some of the work that I've been doing, the research that I've been doing with colleagues like Joe Depler and Dragan Jurasevich, has actually been looking at, can we map social networking at the same time as we're actually mapping their cognitive learning, which is really quite fascinating and has big impact on the learning environments and the conditions of the learning environments that you create. The other thing we know is knowledge, strategies and expertise are contextual. So the context that you find yourself teaching and learning in is highly specific. And so that's also that little bit that I've said, you'll have lots of specific contextual understandings that you need to sort of expand upon so that they can actually operate in other contexts and ultimately globally. So we have to understand the context, and we often don't do that. And while the curriculum allows us to do that, because it's not set in any context, we very rarely find it happening in practice. And so ways to actually sort of come to a STEM education in school then, there's lots of different approaches, but these are 4 that are commonly used, and they're of increasing complexity and sophistication. At the simplest level, you've got disciplinary pedagogy, which we have seen as a major part, particularly of secondary schools, where students learn concepts and skills separately in a single discipline. Okay, so I'm off to science class or I'm off to design technology class. And that's quite common. So that's the simplest. A multidisciplinary pedagogy is also common in schools, and particularly primary schools, is where students learn concepts and skills separately in each discipline, but they have a common theme. So a common theme in Victorian primary schools, for example, is often the school garden. And so that could be one theme, and they do lots of different things. They measure, they do some science, they design them, they can do all those sorts of things. In the interdisciplinary pedagogy, you have students learn concepts and skills from 2 or more disciplines that are more tightly linked. So there's usually a general purpose. So this might be about a project. This could actually be something like, if I take the school garden, could be about designing a sustainable garden at school. Okay, and so it brings in lots of different ideas at the same time. And then the transdisciplinary pedagogy, which is the most sophisticated, is where it's driven by a real world problem and the students are at the centre of it and they have ownership of how that unfolds. So it's a problem or a project that allows them to apply the knowledge and the skills for 2 or more disciplines, and it shapes the students' learning experience. So it's kind of complex, and I sort of encourage people to take the risk to do that, but be aware that you'll probably have, some setbacks. But setbacks in this instance should be seen as an opportunity to learn rather than a failure as such. So I think what I'm urging people to do is to start moving towards the transdisciplinary. It's quite difficult. Do it slowly, do it thoughtfully, dip the toe in the water and be brave. Here's an example of an effective STEM education. It's from the US, and it's based on systems dynamics. And systems thinking tools. And I put it up there because it really just gave an example of, if you're communicating effectively, what would you be doing? So you'd be describing systems concisely and accurately with words and diagrams and using a variety of graphic tools. And I think it's important to remember that we have to be less dependent here on text all the time. Lots of people recognise patterns and graphs and graphic tools far more easily, and visual impact is really important. A photo is also really important. If you're focusing on inquiry and investigating while working in teams, what does that look like in a school setting? So you can investigate how elements change over time, you're focusing on patterns and trends, you're working in teams on problem solving. If you're understanding multiple content areas, what are you doing? You're recognising generic structures, what's the same, what's different, look for the patterns, look at the structures in different settings. And so you're looking for an understanding of system structure that you can apply across different discipline areas, and so on. So these slides I'll leave as available, but I think there's some really good examples that you can use that will demonstrate. So if this is the point of a multidisciplinary or a transdisciplinary experience, learning experience, what am I doing? And that's a really important planning phase for all teachers. So if you engage in an integrated STEM education, what impact is it likely to have on the students? Now, we know from research that the impacts cannot and should not be confined just to academic achievements. The social and environmental contexts are equally important. So what research has shown is that students who engage in STEM education or an integrated curriculum outperform students who engage in a more traditional single discipline curriculum based on academic assessment. We also know that STEM education improves student achievement, interest, motivation, and self-efficacy, their belief that they can do it. It improves problem-solving skills and promotes higher-order thinking skills. And the higher-order thinking skills are fundamentally important here because this is what makes humans human and different from computers. Computers are really good at routine algorithmic thinking. Humans who can do that, but they can also do the higher order thinking that is not the algorithmic pattern. It also means that you can nuance your judgment at particular times, so that you can sort of say, gee, you know, the data is telling me something, but, you know, I really, really think that I need to go in this direction. Those are some of the things that are actually about higher order thinking skills that we really have to start to hone and develop and continually use and refine with our students. And we also know that they have an improved ability to apply shared learning outcomes and work together, and their attitudes to the value and appraisal of group work is also much higher. So there's some real tangible benefits for students. Indicators of success. And so for students, it can be quite liberating. Student outcomes, and I take a quote here from Pitt, who's a British researcher. Imagine if students have engaged in open-ended problem-solving activities, which leads to greater confidence in real-life problem-solving, improved teamwork and communication skills. I mean, we all want that in our students. In the longer term, students will have further developed higher order thinking skills, enabling transfer of learning between subject areas. And what we want really is this to be an unconscious transfer, a seamless switching between what they've learned in different subject areas, and what Pitt has called a metacognitive super skill of choosing which mode to think in as a designer, engineer, scientist or mathematician. But there's also some really important indicators of success for STEM education in terms of teachers. Engaging in STEM education from a teacher perspective increases teacher professionalism because it increases teachers' self-efficacy, their ability and belief that they can actually do this. It changes their practice. It improves their understanding of content, but in integrated ways, while at the same time developing what we call their pedagogical content knowledge, their knowledge in order to teach in their particular field, in their particular expert field. We also know from research that some of the indicators are around quality practice. We've got teachers working cooperatively together. They build the relationships to remove those artificial learning barriers in developing their programs of instruction. And it's also a very creative exercise. So they use their skills creatively in coordination with other members of a team, and they develop positive team teaching experiences that are very collaborative. And it's just not one person up the front, one person up the back. They are actually positive team teaching, building positive team teaching experiences where the expertise of the different teachers for the different purposes they've planned for come to the fore. And so finishing up, STEM education has much to offer, but at the heart of it, the system, its success is going to rely on education system, which relies on the quality of the instructional design, the educator support, how do we actually support our teachers to do this work, and more importantly, how we adjust the learning environments. We have to think about schools beyond classrooms, because if you're engaging in this sort of work, the classroom is not the optimal learning environment for you to engage in. And so I take a quote from my colleague Jo Depler and Kathleen Atkins' report that actually looks at learning environments, and it is the first of the Spotlight series. What is clear is that traditional notions of classrooms with their emphasis on teacher-centred approaches need significant rethinking. Learning environments for the future will need to be seriously reimagined. And the photo there is of the Green School in Bali, which is quite famous. If you don't know about it, Google it and have a look. It's built from traditional materials in the traditional culture of the area. And if you've ever seen sort of no classroom walls or anything, this is the optimal experience of it. It's so integrated into its environment. It's multi-age. The activities are driven by the students, and it's about very much sustainable and culturally sustainable activities and learning for the students. So I leave that with you as some final thoughts.